Blood money buys custom Italian silk, compliant politicians, and deafening silence. But it couldn't buy Clara a working spine. Her father owned half the city's underworld. Dean just owned a failing auto shop, dodging debt collectors with hands permanently stained by motor oil. He didn't set out to cross a violent crime lord. He just couldn't stomach a poorly calibrated machine, even a wheelchair. Fixing it was merely instinct. What followed tore his miserable, quiet life apart. Transmission fluid tastes sweet and smells like burnt pennies. Dean knew this because a drop of it had just bypassed his safety goggles and landed directly on the corner of his mouth. He didn't flinch. Flinching under a 2-ton 1998 Buick on a failing hydraulic lift was a good way to get decapitated. He just spat a glob of brown saliva onto the oil-slicked concrete, wiped his mouth with the back of a calloused wrist, and wrenched the torque wrench harder. His garage, a hollowed-out cinder-block husk in the industrial district, was freezing. Rain drummed against the corrugated tin roof in a relentless, punishing rhythm. It was a Tuesday night, pushing 2 in the morning. Sane people were asleep. People with money were in warm beds. Dean was wrestling with a stripped lug nut because his landlord had threatened to break his kneecaps over 3 months of back rent. The hiss of heavy tires on wet asphalt cut through the white noise of the storm. Dean paused, the socket wrench suspended in his grip. The sound didn't belong here. It was too heavy, too smooth. Through the cracked, dirt-caked window of the bay door, sweeping halogen beams sliced through the darkness. A matte black armored SUV, a Cadillac Escalade modified so heavily its suspension groaned, rolled into his lot. It didn't park, it intruded. 4 men stepped out before the engine even cut. They moved with the terrifying fluid synchronization of apex predators. Suits cut from dark, expensive wool. Bulges under the left armpits. Water beaded on their shoulders, but none of them seemed to notice the rain. Dean slid out from under the Buick on his creeper, his spine popping in 3 places. He didn't stand up immediately. He stayed low, wiping grease from his knuckles with a filthy red rag, assessing. "Shop's closed," Dean said, his voice a gravelly rasp, scraped raw by cheap tobacco and exhaustion. The largest of the men, a wall of muscle with a flattened boxer's nose, stepped forward. "Open the bay door." It wasn't a request. The tone was flat, devoid of emotion, the kind of voice that ordered executions before breakfast. Dean looked at the man's shoes. Italian leather, completely ruined by the puddles of antifreeze and rainwater. He looked at the gun barely concealed beneath the jacket. Dean weighed the options. He pulled the heavy chain, the metal door rattling upward with a screech that made his teeth ache. The Escalade pulled inside, bringing the smell of overheated ceramic brakes and burnt rubber. A man stepped out of the rear passenger side. Victor Costa. Dean recognized him not from the news. Victor rarely made the news, but from the whispered, paranoid stories told in the city's dive bars. Victor smelled of sandalwood and ozone. He looked like an accountant who had decided to take up murder as a hobby. Wire-rimmed glasses, a sharp, impeccably tailored trench coat, and eyes that looked like dead grey slate. "Serpentine belt snapped," Victor said quietly. The acoustics of the garage seemed to bend around him. "Water pump seized. It's overheating. We need to be moving in 10 minutes. "An armoured caddy takes specialised parts," Dean muttered, walking toward the steaming hood. "I got salvaged junk in here, mostly sedans, beaters." "You are a mechanic," Victor said, stepping closer. The air grew suddenly thin. "Make it work, or I will have Bruno beat you to death with your own tools." Dean didn't puff out his chest. He didn't offer a witty retort. He needed to live, so he popped the hood. The heat hit his face like an open oven door. He grabbed a heavy-duty worklight, clamping it to the chassis. It was a mess. The aftermarket armor plating trapped the heat, melting the rubber components. As he reached for his ratchets, he glanced into the rear of the SUV through the open door. A girl sat in the back. She looked to be in her early 20s, wrapped in a thick charcoal cashmere coat that swallowed her frame. Her face was pale, framed by dark hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat. She wasn't terrified. She looked profoundly, exhaustingly bored. Next to her, taking up half the cabin, was a machine. It was a wheelchair, but calling it that felt inadequate. It was a monstrous contraption of polished titanium, medical-grade plastics, and thick electronic housings. It looked less like a mobility device and more like a mobile life support unit. It was pristine, gleaming, and completely sterile. Dean averted his eyes and focused on the engine. He found a ribbed belt meant for a Ford truck, cut it, and began MacGyvering a tensioner bypass using a heavy-duty zip tie and a salvaged pulley. His hands moved with brutal efficiency. Grime worked its way under his fingernails. He burned his forearm on the exhaust manifold, the smell of singed arm hair and searing flesh joining the bouquet of the garage. He didn't make a sound. 10 minutes later, he slammed the hood shut. "It'll hold for 50 miles, Dean said, wiping his hands again. "Keep it under 60. The tensioner is rigged. If it snaps, your block cracks." Victor handed him a thick roll of bills, bound with a rubber band. He didn't count it. It was easily $5,000. As Victor turned to leave, Dean's eyes flicked back to the girl in the SUV. She was leaning forward slightly, trying to shift her weight. Her brow furrowed in a sharp, quiet agony. She reached down, her thin fingers gripping the control joystick of the chair, trying to adjust the tilt function. The heavy motors whirred, sluggish and loud. As the seat shifted, her left leg spasmed, knocking against the rigid, unyielding footplate. Dean watched the mechanics of the movement. He watched the way her center of gravity fought against the chair's design. He couldn't help himself. He was a deeply flawed man, a cynic who trusted machines over people, but a bad machine was an insult he couldn't ignore. "Your camber is off," Dean said. The words hung in the damp air. Victor stopped. Bruno's hand drifted instantly to his lapel. The girl in the back slowly turned her head. Her eyes, a startling icy blue, locked onto Dean. They were old eyes in a young face. "What did you say?" Her voice was a rasp, brittle and sharp. "Your chair." Dean pointed a grease-stained finger at the titanium monstrosity. "The doctors or whoever built it gave you a 0-degree wheel camber. They set the center of gravity dead in the middle. It makes it stable, sure. Prevents you from tipping over backward. But it makes it handle like a goddamn refrigerator." Silence stretched. Bruno pulled his weapon halfway out. Dean kept talking, unable to stop the mechanic's diagnosis spilling from his mouth. "Every time you try to turn, you're fighting the entire weight of the battery pack and your own dead weight. The footrests are pitched too high, pushing your femurs up, pinching the sciatic nerve at the hip. That's why your leg is twitching. You're sitting in a multi-$1,000 torture device." Victor's voice was a whisper that carried across the room. "You speak to my daughter again, mechanic, and I will cut your tongue out." Clara, the girl, held up a hand. Victor stopped immediately. She stared at Dean. She didn't look at his scarred face or his dirty clothes. She looked at his hands. She looked at the blood drying on his burnt forearm. "Let's go," Clara said to her father. The doors slammed shut. The Escalade reversed out into the rain, leaving Dean alone with a roll of blood money and the smell of burnt rubber. He shoved the cash into his pocket, walked over to his toolbox, and grabbed a half-empty bottle of cheap whiskey. He took a long, burning swallow. He figured he would never see them again. He was wrong. 4 days passed. The rain stopped, leaving the city trapped in a suffocating, humid greyness. Dean had paid his landlord, bought 3 cartons of cigarettes, and spent the rest trying to ignore the creeping paranoia that every black car turning down his street was a hit squad. It was a Thursday afternoon. The garage doors were open. The air smelled of stale beer and cutting fluid. Dean was hunched over a workbench, trying to rebuild a carburetor for a rusty Dodge Dart when the light in the bay was blocked out. He didn't look up immediately. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of thick-soled boots and the distinct, high-pitched whine of heavy-duty electric motors. He wiped his hands and turned. Clara Costa was sitting in the middle of his garage. In the daylight, she looked worse. The dark circles under her eyes were bruised purple. She wore a simple black sweater and jeans, but the way she sat in the massive chair looked exhausted, as if gravity was actively trying to crush her. Behind her stood Bruno, the bruiser from the other night, looking at Dean like he was a stain on the floor. "You said it handles like a refrigerator," Clara said. No greeting, no preamble. Her voice was flat, challenging. Dean picked up a rag. "I said a lot of things, mostly because I'm an idiot with a death wish. You shouldn't be here." "My father is in Chicago for 3 days," Clara said, wheeling herself closer. The chair moved with a jerky, overcompensated acceleration that made her wince. "He thinks I'm at physical therapy. Bruno is here because he prefers getting paid by me to getting shot by my father." Bruno grunted, leaning against the cinder-block wall and lighting a cigarette. Dean stared at her. So, fix it." Dean let out a short, harsh laugh. He threw the rag onto the workbench. "Look at this place, kid. Look at the dirt on the floor. I fix engines. I swap brake pads on beat-up sedans. I don't touch medical equipment. If I break that thing, or worse, if I hurt you, your father will peel my skin off and use it as a throw rug. He'll do that anyway if I tell him you disrespected me," Clara said. There was no malice in her tone, just the cold recitation of a fact. "I have C6 incomplete spinal cord injury. I have partial use of my arms, limited grip strength in my right hand, and absolutely nothing from the ribs down. My father bought me the safest, most expensive chair in Europe. And you hate it." "I despise it," Clara whispered. The sudden raw emotion in her voice caught Dean off guard. She wasn't an arrogant Mafia princess. She was a prisoner. "It weighs 300 pounds. It decides when to brake for me. It beeps when I go too fast. It keeps me completely, perfectly safe. And I feel like I'm already buried in a titanium coffin." Dean looked at the machine. He hated the doctors who designed it. They built it to preserve a life, not to let someone live it. He sighed, running a hand over his greasy face. He walked over to her. Bruno tensed, dropping his cigarette and crushing it beneath his boot. Dean ignored him. He knelt on the filthy concrete beside Clara's chair. Up close, she smelled like sterile alcohol wipes and expensive lavender. He felt a strange, uncomfortable knot in his chest. He shoved it down. He was a mechanic. This was just metal and voltage. "I have to touch your legs," Dean said, his voice flat. "To check the clearance." Clara's jaw tightened. "They don't feel anything. Do what you want." Dean placed his hands on her calves. He didn't handle her with the gentle, cloying pity she was clearly used to. He grabbed her left leg, hoisting the dead weight with blunt efficiency, and shoved it slightly to the side to access the locking mechanism of the footplate. Her breath hitched, not from pain, but from the utter lack of reverence. He treated her broken body like a chassis. Strangely, it felt like the most respectful thing anyone had done to her in years. "See here?" Dean pointed to a heavy hydraulic piston beneath the seat. "This is an anti-tilt governor. It prevents the front casters from lifting more than a quarter inch. It means if you hit a curb, you stop dead. Can you remove it?" "I can cut it off with an angle grinder," Dean said, looking up at her. He was inches from her face. He could see the faint pulse in her neck. "But if I do, you could flip backward and crack your skull open." "Cut it off," she said, without hesitating. Dean stared at her for a long second. He saw the suppressed rage in her eyes. It mirrored his own. He stood up. "Bruno, you might want to step outside. Sparks are going to fly, and this place is basically a fire hazard." For the next 4 hours, the garage became a theatre of noise and fire. Dean didn't just tweak the chair, he butchered it. He stripped away the heavy, aesthetic plastic cowlings, exposing the raw aluminum and wiring beneath. The floor became littered with discarded pieces of multi-thousand-dollar medical equipment. He used a blowtorch to heat and bend the caster forks, increasing the angle to give the front wheels a sharper, more aggressive turning radius. He stripped the restrictive governor from the motors. Bypassing the safety chip with a soldering iron and wire, he ripped from an old car radio. Clara stayed in the chair the entire time. She refused to move to a regular seat. She flinched as sparks from the grinder rained down, pinging off the heavy denim of her jeans, the smell of ozone and burning paint filling the damp air. Dean worked around her with a brusque intimacy, his rough hands brushing against her knees, his shoulder pressing against her hip as he reached under the seat to adjust the battery mount. He was sweating profusely, a streak of grease across his forehead. He cursed under his breath when a bolt snapped, his frustration genuine and unfiltered. Clara watched him. She wasn't used to seeing someone sweat for her without asking for praise. He was just angry at the stubborn metal, treating the chair not as a symbol of her tragedy, but as a mechanical puzzle that had the audacity to be poorly designed. "You're shifting the battery weight," Clara noted, her voice cutting through the hum of the cooling grinder. "Yeah," Dean grunted, wiping sweat from his eyes. "Moved it 3 inches back and dropped it lower. Drops your center of gravity. I also pitched the rear wheels to a 3-degree negative camber. It's going to look a little wider, like a sports car. Means you can spin on a dime without the kinetic energy throwing you sideways." "Will it be faster?" Dean looked up, a dark, cynical smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Lady, without the software governor, these twin 500-watt motors are going to dump raw torque directly to the axles. It's going to kick like a mule." He tightened the final hex bolt with a loud squeak of metal. He stepped back, his back screaming in protest, and tossed the wrench onto the bench. "Try it." The alley behind Dean's garage was a corridor of urban decay. Broken green glass from beer bottles sparkled in the dim afternoon light, mixed with scattered gravel, rusted cans, and the slick sheen of motor oil bleeding from the asphalt. It was not wheelchair accessible. Bruno stood by the rolling garage door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of deep, career-threatening concern. Dean leaned against the brick wall, a freshly lit cigarette dangling from his lips, the smoke curling around his squinted eyes. Clara sat at the mouth of the alley. Stripped of its bulky plastic armor, the titanium chair looked predatory. It was lower to the ground, the wheels splayed outward in an aggressive stance. The wires were exposed, zip-tied roughly to the frame. It looked like something built in a wasteland, not a hospital. "The joystick is going to be hypersensitive," Dean called out, his voice echoing off the brick. "There's no software curve smoothing out your inputs anymore. You push it, it goes. Keep your weight forward." Clara took a breath. Her thin, pale fingers curled around the black rubber of the joystick. For 2 years, every movement she made had been filtered through safety protocols. Every push had been met with a sluggish, delayed whine of gears. She pushed the stick forward. The chair didn't whine. It snarled. The motors dumped raw power to the rear wheels, and they spun for a fraction of a second on the loose gravel before catching traction. Clara jerked backward, her breath leaving her in a sharp gasp as the sudden G-force hit her chest. She instinctively pulled the stick to the left to avoid a rotting wooden pallet. Before, the chair would have braked, beeped, and slowly initiated a wide, lumbering turn. Now the chair snapped left instantly. The negative camber on the wheels dug into the asphalt, holding the sharp angle without tipping. She narrowly missed the pallet, the metal footrest shaving a splinter of wood off the edge. "Jesus!" Bruno yelled, stepping forward. "Back off!" Clara screamed. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was a roar. She pushed the stick again. She flew down the alley. The suspension, which Dean had tightened to remove the sickening, boat-like sway, transferred every bump and crack of the asphalt directly into her spine. It jarred her teeth. It rattled her bones. It hurt. And it was the most magnificent thing she had felt in 24 months. She reached the end of the alley, jammed the stick back and to the right. The chair went into a violent spin, the rubber tires screeching against the concrete. She drifted, a perfect, tight 180-degree turn, stopping facing Dean and Bruno. The silence in the alley was thick, save for the low, predatory hum of the hot electric motors. Clara's chest was heaving. Her hair had fallen out of its pristine clip, hanging wildly around her face. Her knuckles were white. Then a sound broke from her throat. It was ragged, ugly, and totally unguarded. It was a laugh. It started small, a vibrating chuckle in her chest, and erupted into full, breathless laughter. She threw her head back, laughing until tears pricked the corners of her eyes, the sheer, unadulterated rush of adrenaline washing away the sterile numbness of her existence. Dean watched her. The cigarette burned down to the filter, singeing his fingers, but he didn't drop it. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt a heavy, terrifying weight settle in his gut. He had taken a caged bird and given it a jet engine. He had also just fundamentally altered a piece of machinery owned by a man who butchered people for minor insults. "It's loud," Clara panted, wheeling back toward them at a brisk, smooth pace. Her eyes were wildly bright, the deadened look completely gone. "I stripped the acoustic dampeners," Dean said, flicking the cigarette away. "Weight reduction. You want quiet? Go back to the hospital." "I don't want quiet," she said, stopping inches from him. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't look like a mob boss's daughter. She looked like a girl who had just remembered how to run. "How much?" Dean looked at the wad of cash still sitting on his workbench from the other night. "It's on the house. Consider it an apology for the crude bedside manner. Now, take your death trap and get out of my alley before my landlord calls the cops on the noise." Clara stared at him, a complex shift of emotions playing across her face. "You're a rude, filthy man, Dean. And you're a liability. Goodbye, Clara." Bruno wheeled her back to the black SUV waiting on the street. Dean watched them leave, pulling the corrugated metal door down hard. He locked it, deadbolted it, and went to the rusted sink in the corner to scrub the grease off his hands with pumice soap. The water ran black down the drain. He told himself it was over. He had fixed the machine. The equation was balanced. He was an idiot. The piece lasted exactly 48 hours. Saturday evening, the sky was a bruised purple, bleeding into night. Dean was under the hood of a Ford F-150, trying to diagnose a phantom misfire. The shop radio was playing low, static-filled classic rock. The low rumble of engines didn't register until the vibrations shook the tools on his workbench. He slid out from the truck, wiping his hands on a rag, and froze. It wasn't one SUV this time. It was 3. They blocked the street in front of his garage, their headlights cutting through the dusk like searchlights in a prison yard. The doors opened in unison. A dozen men stepped out, fanning out around the perimeter of the garage. Dean felt his heart slam against his ribs. The cold spike of pure, unfiltered terror pierced his chest. He backed up slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy steel crowbar resting on the nearest table. It was a pathetic gesture, and he knew it. The center vehicle's door opened. Victor Costa stepped out. He wasn't wearing a suit tonight. He wore a dark turtleneck and a leather jacket. He looked less like an accountant and more like the butcher the stories claimed he was. Victor walked slowly into the garage, the heavy soles of his shoes clicking against the concrete. He stopped 10 feet from Dean. He looked around the squalid shop, his lip curling slightly in distaste, before his dead grey eyes locked onto Dean. "My daughter," Victor said softly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the idling SUVs outside. "Came home from physical therapy 2 days ago." Dean swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the crowbar until his knuckles ached. "Listen, Costa." Victor raised a single finger. Silence fell instantly. She came home. Her clothes smelled of cigarette smoke, ozone, and burnt rubber. Her hands were blistered. Victor took a step closer. The smell of sandalwood and violence washed over Dean. "Her doctors," Victor continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "informed me that her wheelchair had been fundamentally destroyed. The safety limiters were gutted. The structural integrity was compromised. They told me it was a miracle she hadn't killed herself." Dean didn't speak. He couldn't. He calculated the distance to the side door, knowing he'd catch 3 bullets in the back before he turned the knob. Victor stared at him, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on Dean's chest. Then Victor did something completely unexpected. He reached into his leather jacket. Dean flinched, bracing for the gun. Instead, Victor pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope and tossed it onto the hood of the F-150. It landed with a heavy, substantial thud. "But then," Victor said, his voice catching slightly, cracking the terrifying veneer for a fraction of a second, "I watched her in the courtyard. I watched her move." Victor swallowed, his jaw tightening. "I haven't seen my daughter smile since the accident. Since the blast that was meant to tear me in half shattered her spine instead. 2 years of the best doctors in the world giving me pity and clinical safety. 2 years of watching her rot from the inside out." Victor pointed a finger at Dean's chest. "You broke a $200,000 piece of medical equipment. You endangered my blood." He stepped closer, invading Dean's personal space, his eyes burning with an intense, complicated fire. "You work for me now," Victor whispered. "You close this filthy garage. You pack your tools. You belong to the Costa family, and you're going to build her whatever she wants. Because if you refuse, or if you try to run..." Victor patted the manila envelope. "That envelope contains enough money to buy your life, or end it. The choice is yours, mechanic." Dean stared at the envelope. The golden cage had just slammed shut, and he was the one who had built the hinges. The Coaster estate sat on 40 acres of prime coastal woodland, walled off from the world by 10-foot-high wrought iron and limestone. To Dean, it looked like a high-end penitentiary. They gave him the carriage house. Calling it a garage was an insult to the architecture. It featured radiant-heated epoxy floors, climate control, and a pneumatic tool setup that belonged in an F1 pit lane. The air smelled of expensive carnauba wax and imported tile cleaner. Dean hated it instantly. It was sterile. It lacked the history of spilled oil and desperation that flavored his old shop. His first act of rebellion was to drag a greasy, salvaged engine block from the back of his beat-up pickup and drop it squarely in the center of the pristine white floor. The thick sludge pooled outward like a bruised vein. He didn't see Clara for the first week. He dealt entirely with Victor's logistics man, a weasel named Paulie, who handed Dean a platinum corporate card and told him to order whatever he needed. Dean ordered a commercial Tiggs welder, sheets of aviation-grade aluminum, high-torque brushless motors, and 3 cases of cheap domestic beer. Paulie sneered at the beer but didn't say a word. On the 8th day, the electronic lock on the carriage house door clicked, echoing loudly over the drone of a belt sander. Dean hit the power switch, the sander whining down to a halt. He wiped a streak of aluminum dust off his forehead and turned around. Clara wheeled in. The modified titanium chair purred under her control. She wore grey sweatpants and a faded vintage band t-shirt, looking less like a Mafia princess and more like a restless insomniac. The dark circles under her eyes were back, and a deep, frustrated tension radiated from her shoulders. "You've been hiding," she said. "I've been working," Dean replied, gesturing to the whiteboard behind him, covered in chaotic, grease-smudged schematics. "And waiting for someone to tell me what I'm supposed to be building. Your father bought me, but he didn't give me a blueprint." Clara wheeled closer. She stopped at the edge of the oil stain, looking down at it, then up at Dean. "I hate the house. It has an elevator, ramps, wide doors. Everything is frictionless. It makes me feel sick. Most people would kill for frictionless. Most people aren't trapped in their own bodies." Clara gestured toward the massive bay windows, looking out over the sprawling, heavily wooded acreage behind the estate. "Before the bomb, I used to hike out there. Miles of trails, steep ravines, mud, roots. I know every inch of those woods. Now, I can only look at them through bulletproof glass." Dean followed her gaze to the dense tree line. He looked back at her chair. "Those caster wheels would dig into the mud and snap within 10 feet. You'd get stuck, the battery would die, and I'd get shot for letting you freeze to death. So build me something that won't snap." Dean leaned against his workbench, crossing his arms. He studied her. She wasn't asking for a mobility aid. She was asking for a siege weapon against her own limitations. "You want an off-road rig," Dean said, the gears already turning in his head. "Heavy suspension, independent drivetrain, wide tread footprint to distribute the weight over soft ground." "I want to feel the gravel under me," Clara said, her voice dropping, a raw, desperate edge bleeding into the words. "I want to hit a bump and feel it in my jaw. I want to go fast enough to be scared again." Dean turned back to his whiteboard. He picked up a black marker and drew a heavy, brutalist chassis. "Tank treads are too slow. They chew up the ground, but they drag. We use ATV tires, 4-wheel drive, independent A-arm suspension with coil-over shocks. We mount a racing seat with a 5-point harness, because if this thing rolls, you don't have the core strength to brace yourself." Clara wheeled up right next to him. She didn't smell like lavender today. She smelled like coffee and stale anxiety. "Can you do it?" "With your father's credit card. I could build you a lunar rover." Dean tossed the marker onto the tray. "But it's going to be violent. It won't beep to warn you about obstacles. It won't have a gyroscope to keep you perfectly level. If you drive it into a ditch, it will flip, and you will break your neck." "For real this time?" Clara looked at him, her ice blue eyes unflinching. "Dean." "What?" "Stop trying to talk me out of living." Dean held her gaze. He saw the sheer, unadulterated stubbornness in her jaw. It mirrored the stubbornness of a rusted-on bolt that refused to turn. He respected it. "All right," Dean said, turning his back to her and pulling down his welding mask. "Grab that tablet over there and look up suspension geometries for a Polaris RZR. If you're going to drive this monster, you're going to help me design the wheelbase." The build took 3 weeks of brutal, sleep-deprived labor. The carriage house smelled permanently of ozone, melting flux, and cheap coffee. Dean lived in a state of perpetual grime, sleeping on a cot in the corner, ignoring the sprawling guest suite Paulie had assigned him. He belonged with the metal. Clara practically lived in the shop with him. She showed up at dawn, a steaming mug of black coffee balanced precariously on her lap, and stayed until Bruno practically dragged her back to the main house at midnight. She wasn't just a spectator. Dean refused to let her be one. "Hold this," Dean grunted, sliding a heavy steel bracket across the workbench. Clara reached out with her right hand. Her fingers curled around the metal, but as she tried to lift it, a sudden violent spasm racked her arm. Her fingers opened against her will, and the heavy bracket slammed onto the steel bench with a deafening clang, narrowly missing Dean's hand. Silence flooded the shop. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a deep, humiliated flush crawling up her neck. She hated the spasms. They were a brutal reminder of the crossed wires in her spinal cord, the misfiring signals she couldn't control. She waited for Dean to apologize, to gently take the metal away, to tell her it was okay, she didn't need to help. That's what the physical therapists did. "Damn it, Clara," Dean barked, snatching the bracket up. "You gotta lock your wrist before you lift. The weight's shifting too fast. It's triggering a reflex arc." She opened her eyes, startled. "I can't control the reflex." "I didn't say stop the reflex. I said change the leverage." Dean grabbed a thick roll of hockey tape from his toolbox. He took her right hand, ignoring the way her skin felt terrifyingly soft against his calluses, and began wrapping the tape aggressively around her palm and wrist, stiffening the joint. "You don't have the grip strength for a raw lift," Dean said, his voice dropping into the clinical, detached tone of a mechanic solving a geometry problem. "So we brace the fulcrum. Now your forearm takes the load, not your fingers. Try it." He shoved the bracket back toward her. Clara stared at her taped hand. She took a breath, locked her elbow, and slid her hand under the steel. She lifted. It was heavy, and her bicep trembled violently, but her wrist held. She lifted it off the table. She looked up at Dean, her chest heaving slightly, a fierce, triumphant light in her eyes. Dean didn't smile. He just nodded and sparked the blowtorch. "Good. Hold it steady. I need to tack weld the seam." He brought the blue flame down, the blinding light reflecting off Clara's face. She didn't look away. For the first time in 2 years, she felt useful, not fragile. Useful. The illusion of their isolated world shattered 3 days later. Carmine stepped into the carriage house. He was Victor's underboss, a man who wore perfectly tailored 3-piece suits and possessed the cold, dead eyes of a shark. He didn't come alone. 2 men, built like brick walls, flanked him. Dean was underneath the chassis of the new rig, ratcheting a sway bar into place. He saw the polished Italian leather shoes stop inches from his creeper. "You're making a mess of my boss's floor, grease monkey." Carmine's voice was smooth, like oiled glass. Dean slid out, staying seated on the creeper. He wiped his hands on a rag, looking up at the three men. "Floor's epoxy. It wipes clean. What do you want, Carmine?" "Respect, for starters." Carmine looked around the shop, his lip curling at the empty beer cans and the chaotic sprawl of tools. "Victor thinks you're some kind of miracle worker. I think you're a liability. You're a civilian playing in a world that will swallow you whole." "I'm a mechanic," Dean said flatly. "I don't play in your world. I build what I'm told to build." "You're building a coffin." Carmine stepped closer, his shadow falling over Dean. "If that crippled girl gets hurt on this contraption, Victor won't just kill you. He'll lose his mind. And when the boss loses his mind, the business suffers. I don't like when the business suffers." Carmine leaned down, invading Dean's space, the smell of heavy cologne cloying in the air. "Slow down the build. Tell them it can't be done. Break it. I don't care. But this little project ends." "No, it doesn't." The voice cut through the heavy air like a whip crack. Clara sat in the doorway, her modified wheelchair humming aggressively. She wheeled forward, the motors whining as she closed the distance. She didn't look at the bodyguards. She locked eyes entirely with Carmine. "Clara," Carmine said, standing up and smoothing his tie, his tone instantly shifting to a sickeningly sweet patronization. "I was just checking on the progress, ensuring your safety." "You were threatening my mechanic," Clara said. Her voice was pure ice. It was her father's voice. "Get out of my shop." Carmine's jaw tightened. "Your father is in New York until Friday. I am here, and I am telling you to leave." She pushed the joystick forward, bringing the heavy titanium chair within an inch of Carmine's shins. "Do not come back here, Carmine. If you interfere with this build again, I won't tell my father you threatened Dean. I'll tell him you threatened me." A dangerous silence stretched. Carmine's eyes flicked to Dean, burning with a silent promise of violence, before settling back on Clara. "As you wish," Carmine murmured. He turned and walked out, his muscle following closely behind. Dean let out a long, ragged exhale, tossing his rag onto the workbench. "You just painted a massive target on my back, kid." "He was going to kill you anyway once the build was done," Clara said matter-of-factly, wheeling closer to the chassis. "He sees you as an uncontrollable variable. The Mafia hates variables." Dean stared at her. "And what do you see me as?" Clara stopped. She looked at the raw steel frame of the off-road rig, then up at Dean's grease-stained, exhausted face. "The only person in this god-forsaken compound who doesn't treat me like I'm already dead." Dean swallowed hard. He turned back to the chassis, grabbing his socket wrench. "We need to finish the steering column. Get the tape. Your grip is slipping." They called it the scrap hound. It was ugly. It was beautiful. It was a low-slung, tubular steel roll cage, mounted on an independent long-travel ATV suspension. It had thick, knobby mud tires, a battery bank scavenged from a wrecked Tesla, and twin high-torque electric motors that could produce enough raw power to snap a man's neck. Inside the cage was a molded racing seat with a rigid 5-point harness. Instead of a steering wheel, which Clara couldn't grip tightly enough to turn under heavy resistance, Dean had fabricated a twin-stick tank steering system. Push both forward to go straight, pull back to brake, push one to pivot. The levers were wrapped in thick, textured grip tape, counterweighted so they required minimal arm strength to engage, but translated into massive mechanical leverage. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, carrying the heavy scent of damp pine needles and turned earth from a rainstorm the night before. They were at the edge of the estate's sprawling woods. Bruno stood a few yards away, looking deeply unhappy, a walkie-talkie clutched in his massive hand. Dean stood next to the hound, double-checking the heavy latch on the roll cage door. Clara was strapped in. She wore a heavy canvas jacket and a full-face motocross helmet. Dean had insisted on the helmet. "Listen to me," Dean said, leaning in through the window netting. The smell of fresh rubber and charged ozone was intoxicating. "The torque delivery is instantaneous. You do not ease into the throttle. If you hit a mud pit and feather the sticks, you will sink. You commit. You blast through it. Momentum is your only suspension out there." Clara's eyes were visible through the helmet's visor. They were wide, the pupils dilated with a cocktail of pure terror and adrenaline. "What if I flip?" Her voice was slightly muffled, breathless. "The cage is rated for a rollover at 60 miles an hour. You won't crush, but you will hang upside down until Bruno and I drag you out, so don't flip." He reached out, his bare, calloused hand gripping her heavily gloved shoulder. He squeezed, hard. "You're in control of the machine, Clara. It doesn't own you. Make it work for you." Clara swallowed, nodding once. Dean stepped back. "Fire it up." Clara reached to the center console and flipped the heavy aviation toggle switch. The machine didn't roar. It was electric. It emitted a rising, predatory whine, a high-frequency hum that vibrated in the chest. She gripped the twin sticks. She took a deep breath, fighting the tremor in her arms. She pushed them forward. The scrap hound exploded off the grass. It tore a 10-foot trench of turf and mud into the pristine lawn, launching forward with neck-snapping violence. Clara was slammed back into the racing seat, the 5-point harness digging brutally into her collarbones. She hit the tree line in under 4 seconds. Dean watched as the machine vanished into the dense brush, the sound of snapping branches and the high-pitched whine of the motors echoing back. Inside the cage, Clara's world was a blur of green and brown. The suspension ate the tree roots, the heavy shocks compressing and rebounding violently. Her teeth rattled. The steering sticks bucked in her hands, fighting her, demanding every ounce of her limited upper body strength. She hit a steep, muddy incline. Instinctively, she pulled back slightly, afraid of the angle. The tires spun, slick mud flying up, hitting the windshield mesh. The hound began to slide backward, gravity threatening to drag her down into a deep ravine to her right. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. She was failing. She was trapped again. "You commit. You blast through it." Dean's gravelly voice echoed in her head. Clara gritted her teeth. A raw, guttural scream ripped from her throat. A scream of 2 years of suppressed rage, of pitying glances, of sterile rooms and useless legs. She shoved both sticks forward as hard as she could. The twin motors shrieked. The knobby tires dug through the slick surface mud, finding the hard-packed rock beneath. The hound lurched forward, violently cresting the hill and catching half a second of air before slamming down onto the plateau above. Clara jammed the left stick back and pushed the right forward. The machine spun on a dime, throwing a massive spray of mud into the air, and came to a dead halt overlooking the estate. Silence descended, broken only by the heavy panting of her own breath and the cooling tick of the motors. Her arms were screaming in agony. Her shoulders felt dislocated. She was covered in a fine mist of muddy water. She reached up with trembling fingers and unlatched her visor, flipping it up. The cold wind hit her sweaty face. She looked down at her legs, strapped rigidly into the footwell. They were dead, useless weight. But for the first time since the bomb, they hadn't stopped her. Down below, Dean and Bruno were jogging toward the hill. Dean reached the plateau first, his chest heaving, his boots covered in mud. He walked up to the side of the cage, looking through the netting. He saw her chest rising and falling rapidly. He saw the white-knuckle grip she still had on the steering sticks. "You stalled on the incline," Dean said, his voice flat, trying to hide the fact that his heart had nearly stopped when he saw her slide backward. Clara looked at him. A slow, brilliant, completely unrestrained smile broke across her face. It transformed her. The cold, cynical Mafia daughter vanished, replaced by someone entirely alive. "I didn't stall," Clara panted, a laugh bubbling up in her chest. "I found traction." Dean stared at that smile. He felt a sudden, terrifying shift in his chest, a tight, painful pull that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with the woman in the cage. He realized, with a sinking feeling of absolute certainty, that he wasn't just building machines anymore. He was building a way to keep her alive, and he was hopelessly, dangerously attached to the outcome. "You tore up your father's prize-winning lawn," Dean muttered, desperately trying to maintain his gruff exterior as he unlatched the netting. "Screw the lawn," Clara breathed. She reached out, her muddy, gloved hand grabbing Dean's jacket. She pulled him slightly closer against the cage. "Recharge the battery, Dean. I want to go again." The scrap hound sat in the center of the carriage house, bleeding clumps of dried mud onto the pristine epoxy floor. It was Thursday night. The high bay halogen lights hummed a low, synthetic note. Dean was under the chassis, a grease gun in hand, repacking the front wheel bearings. He was exhausted. His knuckles were busted open from a slipped wrench, wrapped in electrical tape because he hadn't bothered to find bandages. Clara was parked near his toolbox in her modified indoor chair. She held a damp rag, methodically wiping down the scarred steel tubing of the hound's roll cage. It was a menial task, something Bruno usually would have done, but she had fiercely demanded to do it herself. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy, packed tight with the adrenaline of the past 3 days. She had driven the hound every afternoon, pushing the machine and herself closer to the breaking point. She was bruised. Her ribs ached from the 5-point harness. She had never looked better. "You've got a micro-fracture on the left A-arm weld," Dean said, his voice echoing slightly from under the carriage. "I need to grind it out and rebead it tomorrow. You took that drop-off too hard today." "I took it exactly how you told me to," Clara replied, tossing the dirty rag onto the bench. "I committed." Dean slid out on the creeper, wiping his hands on his jeans. He sat up, grabbing a half-empty bottle of water. "There's committing, and then there's trying to see if the laws of physics apply to you. You're getting reckless." "I'm getting fast," she corrected. Dean looked at her. The harsh overhead light caught the sharp angle of her jaw and the dark, smudged grease on her cheekbone. She wasn't an invalid anymore. She was a driver, but the reality of their situation was a cold draft creeping under the door. "Your old man gets back tomorrow," Dean said, the words souring his tongue. "He's going to see this thing. He's going to see the bruises on your neck from the harness." Clara's expression hardened. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by the familiar, guarded frost. "He'll understand, once he sees it move." "Carmine won't let him see it move," Dean said flatly. He stood up, his spine popping. "Carmine's been poison dripping his ear for 2 weeks, telling him I'm building a death trap, telling him I'm out of control." Your father doesn't tolerate variables. Tomorrow he shuts this down, and he probably buries me under the foundation." Clara wheeled forward, the motors whining sharply. She stopped inches from him. "I won't let them touch you." "You don't have the muscle, Clara," Dean said, his voice dropping, stripping away the mechanic's bravado. He crouched down so he was at eye level with her. He smelled the faint trace of lavender, entirely overpowered by the sharp tang of hot metal and sweat. "You're the boss's daughter. That protects you. It doesn't protect the hired help. Once Victor decides I'm a risk, I'm dead." Clara reached out. Her taped, weak hand grabbed the front of his oil-stained shirt. Her grip was pathetic, physically, but the sheer force of her intent locked him in place. "Then we leave," she whispered. Dean froze. The ambient hum of the lights suddenly felt deafening. "What?" "Tonight," Clara said, her breathing shallow, her eyes wide and completely serious. "You have your truck. We load the Hound on the flatbed trailer. We just drive through the gate. Bruno is on shift. He won't shoot us. We just go." "Go where?" Dean asked, a harsh, humorless laugh escaping his chest. "You need a specialized medical setup. You need physical therapy. You need a sterile environment. I sleep on a cot next to a drain that smells like sulfur. I don't need sterile." Clara's voice cracked, a desperate, angry sound. She pulled on his shirt, forcing him closer. "I was rotting in sterile. Look at me, Dean. Look at my hands." She held up her trembling, taped fingers, covered in grim. "They're dirty. I'm sore. And I want to stay this way. If I stay here, Carmine will eventually convince my father to lock me away in a padded room for my own safety. Please." Dean looked at her face. He saw the terrifying vulnerability beneath the grit. He was a man who fixed broken things, but this wasn't a machine. This was a human life, tethered to a violent world, asking him to cut the line. He didn't get a chance to answer. The heavy steel door of the carriage house didn't open with a keypad click. It blew inward. The explosion was a deafening, concussive wave of heat and shattered deadbolt parts. Dean reacted on pure instinct. He grabbed Clara's chair by the armrest and violently shoved it backward, throwing himself over the hood of his rusted pickup truck as a spray of automatic gunfire chewed a line of holes across the workbench where they had just been. Sparks rained down from the severed pneumatic lines above. Compressed air hissed loudly, violently whipping a rubber hose across the room. 4 men stepped through the smoking doorway. They weren't wearing the sharp suits of Victor's inner circle. They wore tactical black, faces covered by neoprene masks. Hitmen. Outsiders. Carmine wasn't waiting for Friday. "Take out the mechanic. Make the girl look like a crash." A muffled voice barked over the hissing air. Dean hit the floor behind his truck, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had no gun. He had a socket wrench in his back pocket and a shop full of heavy, blunt objects. He looked to his left. Clara's chair had spun out of control and slammed into the side of the scrap hound. She was pinned between the 2 machines, terrified but unhurt. "Clara, get in the cage!" Dean roared, his voice tearing his throat. A bullet punched through the quarter panel of his truck, raining rust chips into his hair. Dean grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the floorboards. 2 men advanced down the left flank, sweeping their rifles. Dean didn't wait to be flanked. He scrambled under the truck, sliding across the slick epoxy floor on his stomach, and came out the other side, right at the first man's boots. Dean swung the crowbar in a brutal upward arc. The heavy forged steel caught the hitman in the kneecap. The bones snapped with a sickening, wet crunch. The man screamed, his rifle firing wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed. Dean didn't pause. He scrambled up, grabbing the falling man's tactical vest, and threw him into the path of the second gunman. Across the garage, Clara was fighting her own body. Panic was causing her legs to spasm violently, kicking against the footrests of her titanium chair. She grabbed the heavy steel door of the scrap hound's roll cage, popping the latch. She grabbed the overhead bar, locking her right elbow, and dragged her useless lower half out of the wheelchair and into the racing seat. It was ugly. It was an uncoordinated tumble of dead limbs, but she fell into the deep bucket seat. She didn't bother with the 5-point harness. She reached forward and flipped the ignition toggle. The twin 500-watt electric motors whined to life, a high, predatory shriek cutting through the gunfire. The third and fourth gunmen turned toward the noise. They saw the mud-caked brutalist off-road rig sitting in the center of the shop. "Shoot the battery," one yelled, raising his rifle. Clara slammed both steering sticks forward. The scrap hound didn't just accelerate, it launched. With no software governor and raw torque dumping to the knobby tires, the 800-pound machine cleared the distance in a second. The heavy, tubular steel front bumper caught the third gunman squarely in the chest. The impact was horrific, a dull, meaty thud that lifted the man off his feet and threw him violently backward into the heavy tool chests. Drawers exploded outward, showering the floor with wrenches and sockets. The fourth gunman panicked. He fired wildly at the hound's windshield. 2 rounds shattered the plexiglass, one grazing the heavy fabric of the passenger seat, the other ricocheting off the roll cage, inches from Clara's helmetless head. Clara pulled the right stick back hard. The hound spun, the tires shrieking against the epoxy, the heavy rear tire clipping the gunman's shins and sweeping him to the ground. Dean was grappling with the second man. The hitman had dropped his rifle and pulled a combat knife, slashing a shallow, burning line across Dean's bicep. Dean grunted in pain, dropping the crowbar. He head-butted the man, the crunch of cartilage vibrating through his own skull, and shoved him backward. The man stumbled back, right into the path of the spinning scrap hound. Clara didn't break. She shoved the sticks forward. The machine rolled over the man's legs, pinning him to the ground beneath the heavy tread. Silence slammed back into the garage, broken only by the hiss of compressed air, the groans of broken men, and the low, angry hum of the hound's electric motors. Dean stood up, clutching his bleeding arm. His breath tore through his lungs in ragged gasps. He looked at Clara. She was pale, her hands clamped onto the steering sticks so tightly her knuckles were translucent. She had just used his machine to crush a man. Before either of them could speak, the screech of tires outside broke the spell. Heavy doors slammed. Floodlights cut through the smoke pouring from the destroyed doorway. "Hold your fire!" a voice bellowed. It wasn't Carmine. Victor Costa walked into the ruined carriage house. He was flanked by Bruno and a dozen heavily armed loyalists. He wore a dark topcoat over a charcoal suit, looking perfectly immaculate despite the slaughterhouse around him. Victor stopped. He looked at the bodies on the floor. He looked at Dean, bleeding and holding a bloody crowbar. Then his slate-grey eyes locked onto Clara. She was sitting in a machine that looked like a weapon of war, not a medical device. Her hair was wild, her face smudged with dirt, and she wasn't hiding behind a protective shell. She looked dangerous. Victor slowly walked forward. His men fanned out, securing the surviving hitmen. "Carmine sent them," Clara said, her voice shaking with adrenaline, not fear. "He wanted to kill Dean. He wanted to make it look like an accident." Victor stopped at the side of the hound. He placed a gloved hand on the muddy roll cage. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, devastatingly old. I know, Victor said softly. Carmine is currently bleeding out in the trunk of my car. I took an early flight. Victor looked at Dean. You saved her. She saved me. Dean spat, pressing a dirty rag against his bleeding arm. Your house is a snake pit, Costa. I built her a machine to survive the woods. I didn't know she'd need it to survive her own driveway. Victor's jaw tightened. He looked back down at his daughter. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a streak of black grease from her cheek. Clara didn't lean into the touch. She sat perfectly still, her hands still gripping the controls. You're bleeding, Victor murmured. I'm alive, Clara replied, her voice cold and hard. For the first time in 2 years, I am actually alive. But I can't stay here, Dad. If I stay here eventually, one of your enemies will use me as leverage. Or worse, one of your friends will. Victor withdrew his hand. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. A Mafia boss didn't let his blood walk away. It was a sign of weakness. It was a fracture in the empire. Victor looked around the garage. He looked at the sterile, expensive equipment ruined by gunfire and blood. He looked at the brutal, ugly machine Dean had built, a machine that prioritized freedom over safety. Bruno, Victor said, not turning around. Hook the flatbed trailer to the mechanic's truck. Dean froze, the rag slipping slightly from his arm. Victor turned to Dean. The look in the older man's eyes was terrifying. It was a promise of absolute violence if Dean ever failed her, mixed with the agonizing surrender of a father who knew he was poison to his own child. You take her, Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. You keep her moving. You keep that machine running. If I ever hear that you let her rot in a sterile room, I will find you and I will cut you to pieces. Dean nodded slowly. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say thank you. He just walked over to his toolbox and grabbed his keys. The rain started an hour outside the city limits. It was a cold, punishing downpour that drummed against the rusted roof of Dean's beat-up Ford F-150. The heater was broken, blasting tepid air against the windshield. The cabin smelled of stale tobacco, wet dog, and the sharp copper tang of the blood drying on Dean's bandaged arm. In the rearview mirror, Dean could barely make out the silhouette of the scrap hound, strapped down tight to the flatbed trailer behind them, water sluicing off its heavy steel cage. Clara sat in the passenger seat. They had managed to get her out of the rig and into the truck cab before leaving the estate. She was slumped against the passenger door, a thin, plaid wool blanket thrown over her legs. She was staring out the window at the blurred passing headlights of oncoming trucks on the interstate. They had no destination. Dean had $40,000 of Victor's blood money stuffed into a duffel bag behind the seat, his tools in the bed, and a Mafia princess with a broken spine sitting next to him. It was an objectively terrible situation. Does it hurt? Clara asked quietly, not turning her head. Dean glanced at his left arm. The knife wound throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I've had worse from a slipping fan belt. I wasn't talking about your arm. She turned her head to look at him. The dashboard lights cast a pale green glow across her face. The adrenaline crash had hit her hard. The fierce, untouchable energy she had in the garage was gone, leaving behind deep exhaustion. Dean gripped the steering wheel, his calluses catching on the worn leather. I lost a shop, a bad landlord, a pile of rusted sedans. I didn't lose anything that matters. You lost the illusion of a quiet life, Clara said. Quiet is overrated, Dean grunted, shifting gears as they hit an incline. The transmission ground slightly, a mechanical complaint he usually would have catalogued to fix later. Quiet is what happens when an engine dies. Clara looked down at her legs, hidden beneath the blanket. My father won't come looking for us, but he won't stop watching. We'll always be looking over our shoulders. Then we better drive fast. Dean reached across the center console. He didn't ask for permission. He grabbed her right hand, the one wrapped in dirty hockey tape, the hand that couldn't hold a wrench but had steered an 800-pound machine through a firefight. He squeezed it. Clara's breath hitched. She didn't pull away. Her weak fingers curled slightly, trying to return the pressure. It was an imperfect, clumsy gesture. It wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was two damaged people, smelling of oil and rain, barreling down a dark highway toward an uncertain, dangerous future. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, closing her eyes and leaning her head back against the glass. "South," Dean said, watching the yellow lines blur into a continuous ribbon. "Somewhere with dirt roads, somewhere with no ramps. We got a machine to test." Clara let out a small, tired laugh. The sound of it mixed with the hum of the tires and the steady beating of the rain. It wasn't the sound of a miracle. It was just the sound of traction. Did Dean and Clara's desperate escape leave you breathless? Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't about fixing what's broken, but building a new way to shatter the limits. If this raw, high-octane story of survival, grease, and undeniable connection got your adrenaline pumping, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a story where the underdogs bite back. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss our next intense, grounded romance. Drop a comment below. What would you name the scrap hound? See you next time.